Hello, everyone, and I'm really pleased that you are here, and what an extraordinary night in the Vail Valley. I know that I'm a North Dakotan, and that means that I'm always gushing about Colorado, but it's because I'm a North Dakotan. All right, so George Orwell, 1903 to 1950, wrote 6 novels, the 2 most famous of which are Animal Farm, 1945, and 1984, 1949. He wrote 3 books of nonfiction, hundreds of book reviews, and many hundreds of essays, many of which are regarded as some of the greatest essays in the English language. He added to our English vocabulary, because of his novel 1984, at least 8 words: doublespeak, newspeak, memory hole, big brother, unperson, thought crime, room 101, and Orwellian. There aren't too many writers who can say that they have added that many words that are central to the thinking of the world that follows them. My role tonight is to be the interlocutor, to interview 2 people. First, Patricia Limerick, the extraordinary author of one of the most important books of our time, Legacy of Conquest, also a MacArthur Prize winner, and one of the founders of the Center of the American West, and a new organization, which she will tell you about later. We've been friends for a very long time, and so here's what's going to happen. Professor Limerick's going to say a few words as a scholar, then she's going to metamorphose into George Orwell. I will then question Orwell, and afterwards, you'll have a chance to raise any questions or thoughts that please you. And then in the end, Patricia Limerick will reemerge to say a few words about what she has just done and her hopes for a new impact of the word Orwellian. So let's begin. Hello, Patricia Limerick.
Howdy. Hi. So I am using a technique tonight that I conjured up quite a few years ago to add energy to my American History survey classes. Well, a quick shift to honesty. What I just said there wasn't true. I didn't actually conjure it up. I stole it from Clay Jenkinson. And I'm not giving it back, so that's a different kind of theft there. They say envy is the most sincere form of flattery, and after seeing Clay in action as Thomas Jefferson, I could not squish the envy I felt when I saw Clay himself becoming a person from the past who hundreds of us had always wanted to meet. An important difference to note in the technique: I do not do costumes or mannerisms or accents. This was an early decision, since the first historic figure I channeled in my American History survey course was Richard Nixon. And I did not want to go anywhere near the makeup that would have endowed me with a 5 o'clock shadow. I didn't want to do that. Nor did I want to adopt President Nixon's mannerisms. No, none of that. So the no costumes rule, not rule, but that got furthered, because I did appear as George Orwell in June on a day in Boulder that was in the 90s, and I had decided I was going to try to do a costume, and I had clothing that would have been very nice in a London winter in an unair-conditioned space on a day that had been in the 90s, and I came close to perishing and joining George Orwell in the afterlife. So never again on that. What we have here is nondescript black clothing with a small special effect, and I'll explain that, this red velvet jacket. Well, in fact, I'll just go there and explain that. So I don't want to give too much away, but George Orwell was in poor health much of his life, and he was very sick when he was in his mid-40s, when he was bedridden and hospitalized much of the time. That is the time that he was writing 1984. he was very sick. He still proposed to a woman. Well, actually, he proposed to quite a few women. And so he got married just a few months before his death. He could not leave the hospital, so his friends took his bride out to a lunch that he could not attend. But his friends also brought him a red velvet smoking jacket to wear during the wedding ceremony in the hospital bed, while he was in the hospital bed. And so I am wearing a red velvet jacket. It's not a smoking jacket, it's actually a bolder no smoking jacket. But I am wearing it to give you some sense of what happened to me as I immersed myself in George Orwell's world. So in about 2 minutes, I will fall silent as Patty Limerick, and I will then lend my voice to George Orwell. So in just a couple of minutes, when I say the word I, the referent there is George Orwell. That will continue for a while. As to why I got going on this 2024 attempt at Vulcan mind meld with Orwell, here's the scoop. The year 2024 is the 75th anniversary of the publication of 1984, and the year 2024 is also the 40th anniversary of my moving to Colorado in the year 1984. It is also the 100th anniversary of Franz Kafka's death, which adds to the wildness of this converging of round numbers. So, the coinciding of those anniversaries presented me with a temptation I could not resist. Initially, I was thinking I would persuade Clay to appear as George Orwell. We were not Orwellian in our precision of language. I'm just going to say that. So we communicated about it, and we managed to confuse ourselves with that. So then I ended up thinking, then I shall just do this. I shall steep myself in Orwell, and I will do this. And here's one element of self-disclosure that you probably didn't need to hear, but that you will hear, which is that my husband, Jeff Limerick, was 56 years old when he died of a stroke in 2005. So when I came to a full recognition of the fact that George Orwell died at age 46, only 6 months after he published 1984, I got completely locked into the idea that I owed Orwell the chance to tell people in 2024 about his life. And I also owed him the chance to learn from those people in 2024 about the unending influence and power of his book. I suspect that I would have been possessed by that sense of obligation to the dead if I weren't for my own experience in widowhood 20 years ago, but I think that was a factor. And now, to the point, it is my hope that hearing George Orwell speaking about his life will provide you with new perspectives and new lines of thought when you think about his book, when you read it or reread it or talk to other people who are reading it. So first, a little data point question. How many of you have read 1984? This is an overly literate community here. I'm going to report you for exceeding the levels. People in the United States are not supposed to be that well read these days. So, well, okay, lift up your nation is just, I'll say to that. So, okay, I was going to ask how many of you thought this is an important book and I really should read it sometime, but I'm not going to ask that because that would raise the uncomfortable question of how many books I own that I know are very important that I'm going to read sometime, and that would depress us if we thought about that. So I'm guessing, and we'll get back to this, that you arrived with a bunch of questions about what would George Orwell think of a variety of things, the state of democracy in the United States today, allegations of a stolen election, controversies over interpretations of history, the omnipresence of digital surveillance, fake news, artificial intelligence, and ChatGPT, the deployment of American troops during the global war on terrorism, and good heavens, most poignant and most specific to Mr. Orwell and his health troubles, the resurgence of a drug-resistant tuberculosis. Well, okay, so we will have some time to speak of that, but everyone should remember that George Orwell died on January 21st, 1950, and when we make the transition here, and the word I shifts to Orwell, I will know nothing after January 21st, 1950. So George Orwell was a person of enormous curiosity, and he will want to know. But understand, the I not me, will know nothing. So, a wonderful summation of Mr. Orwell from the Stanford historian Peter Stansky. Orwell made writing about politics into an art and left us one of the most glorious intellectual and literary legacies of the modern age. The one thing I can tell you with absolute certainty, George Orwell was a man of great courage. He held on to life, and he refused to be intimidated by death for years, and he was a person of immeasurable intellectual curiosity, expressing himself without fear of restraint or punishment, and repeatedly demonstrating what might be the greatest feature of intellectual courage, changing his mind when new ideas and new information came to his attention. Your willingness to give him a chance to be heard tonight is a wonderful gift, which I will now presume to accept on Mr. Orwell's behalf.
So while this metamorphosis
It's done.
occurs,
It's done.
let me say that George Orwell, in addition to writing those 6 novels and 3 nonfiction books, wrote magnificent essays, and let me just recommend a few. The Hanging, Can Socialists Be Happy? Why I Write, Politics in the English Language, Shooting an Elephant, A Nice Cup of Tea, Such Were the Joys, Charles Dickens, Confessions of a Book Reviewer, Good Bad Books, Rudyard Kipling, Reflections on Gandhi, and You and the Atom Bomb. If you haven't read his essays, I highly recommend it. Please welcome George Orwell.
Thank you. This will seem odd that a person has traveled through time and prepared notes for that trip. But I will do that. I want you to, from time to time, hear me in my own words. These, I will not start with my own words. I will start, though, to explain why I am speaking to you tonight and why I am willing to rely on the voice of a person I would not have chosen to speak for me. To explain that, I will begin at the ending. When I was writing 1984, my health was ghastly. I had a lung hemorrhage, 1946. I was diagnosed with tuberculosis in 1947. I was bedridden much of the time that I was writing 1984. The book started its life in June of 1947. Excuse me, I got my dates, I'm sorry. These dates were a blur in some ways to me. The book started its life in June of 1949. Tuberculosis ended my life in January of 1950 when I was 46 years old. If you think that this means that I wrote 1984 when I knew I was dying and that I knew that this would be my last book and that the grimness of this book comes from the melancholy and despair of a dying man, you have that wrong. I lived with a commitment to being alive that never faltered. When I tell you what happened on May 20th of 1937, you will know why I began every day with the knowledge that I was living on borrowed time and that every day when I awoke was a gift. On May 20th, 1937, when I was a volunteer in the Spanish Civil War, I was shot in the neck by a sniper. The bullet narrowly missed my carotid artery. So, if you imagine me 10 years after that, more than 10 years after that, you imagine me bedridden and figuring out how to use a typewriter in bed so I could finish a book that I was originally calling The Last Man in Europe, then you can understand that I would not let tuberculosis convince me that I was on my way out of this world. Here's what I wrote in response to my close call in the Spanish Civil War not long after that incident. My first thought, conventionally enough, was for my wife. My second was a violent resentment at having to leave this world, which, when all is said and done, suits me so well. I had time to feel this very vividly. The stupid mischance infuriated me, the meaninglessness of it, to be bumped off, not even in battle, but in the stale corner of the trenches, thanks to a moment's carelessness. I thought, too, of the man who had shot me, wondered what he was like, whether he was a Spaniard or a foreigner, whether he knew he had got me, and so forth. I could not feel any resentment against him. I reflected that as he was a fascist, I would have killed him if I could, but that if he had been taken prisoner and brought before me at this moment, I would merely have congratulated him on his good shooting. It may be, though, that if you were really dying, your thoughts would be quite different. Here's what I have said on many occasions in the years after that close encounter with death. I have the strongest reasons for wanting to stay alive. So, if you were ever to wonder why I continued to be a heavy smoker of cigarettes when I was hospitalized with tuberculosis, you can provide the answer. I was not governed by fear of death. Did I think 1984 would be my last book? No. As I wrote on one occasion several times in the past, I have been supposed to die, but I have always lived on just to spite them. When you know that when I was an infant, I was hospitalized with breathing problems, and when you know I never fully escaped with my lungs and my bronchial passages cleared, then you might be tempted to pity me. But when you know about the intensity of my life, you'll find reason to shift that pity to envy. Remember, I do not know what happened in the world after January 21st of 1950, and I'm going to have to rely on my host and on the group assembled tonight to tell me how the book fared. All I know is that we are here to observe the 75th anniversary of the publication, and I have been given this opportunity to speak for myself.
So let me ask this first question. Your life is immensely intertwined with the British Empire. And by the time of your last days in Jura, in the Hebrides, the empire was beginning to come apart. But from the very beginning, you were born in Bengal. Your father was in the Indian service. Tell us about your origins in empire.
I gained from being a product of the empire. My father was in the Indian civil service. He was an official in the Department of Opium in India. I was born there. My mother moved her children to England very soon afterwards. My time there was very brief. And I think of myself as a beneficiary because I am from India. And my mind has moved, whether I wanted that or not, in the direction of thinking about the empire in its many, many manifestations. I came from that. I also it was not long before people observed in me an intense aversion to authority. So I am a beneficiary of my origins in India for those two reasons. I am a product of the empire. I must attend to it. I must never let it fade from the center of my attention. And I must act on that aversion to authority when the opportunities come up, and they do.
So your father, just to make sure everyone understands this, was involved in the transportation of opium from India for the China trade.
You talk about that.
I have nothing more to say about it, except that that's a very interesting part of the empire. And secondly, by the end of your life, you were certainly in favor of Indian independence.
Of course.
Born in Bengal, but you came back at about 4 months old, spent most of your life in England, never came to the United States, some time in Europe, and particularly during the Spanish Civil War, where you were shot at the throat. You wrote 2 world-class essays about your Indian experience, a hanging and killing the elephant. But you also wrote in your first novel, Burmese Days, really one of the most savage critiques of the British Empire that has ever been penned. So you had this extraordinary relationship. You say you were the beneficiary, but you were one of its most outspoken critics.
I see no benefit to anyone to be shielded. what could possibly be the benefit? And I know that there are thousands and millions who live with that dream of being shielded. I see no benefit in that. That is not who I am. Aversion to authority, what a way to come into the world. What a way to arrive. And to have it reinforced, to go to England, to go to the public schools, so-called public schools, where if you had a young person who did not have a natural aversion to authority, they can learn it there. They can learn it at Eton. They can learn it at Eton very well. And in fact, that was a wonderful place to take do I have to submit to this authority? Do I have to comply with people who create rules of no sense and enforce them without reason or mercy? So, a continuous track. And I do consider myself a beneficiary of that, because there are people who choose to be shielded and they are half alive from that shielding.
I want to come back to Eton and the public school system, but just to jump ahead, because you're on that subject, you did not go to one of the great British universities, Oxford or Cambridge, and instead you joined the Indian service and went out and became an Indian policeman, a policeman in the Indian service. And at one time, in one of the most remote hamlets in Burma, which was then still part of the Indian world, you were responsible for the security of 200,000 Indians. So you had enormous responsibilities, and not all of them agreeable.
Yes.
And there you were soured on the hypocrisies of the British Empire, the mendacity of it, the subterfuge that the empire was doing something on behalf of the people of the subcontinent. You saw through all of that, and yet there's nothing simplistic about your treatment of this.
Right.
So let's go back to Eton. You go to St. Cyprian's School as a first school, but then you go to Eton, and everyone knows Eton, and it's also Harrow and Rugby and Winchester. These are the public schools in England. And when we say public schools in the United States, we mean state schools. In England, public school means exceedingly elite private schools, none more than Eton. How did you wind up there?
Scholarship. And who knows, young people have ambitions, and they embrace the ambition, and then they, well, in my case, they are ambitious, and then they become very poor students. That will happen. Happens to others. I've said this, but I cannot think of a better training program for resistance to inflexible authority than a British public school, than Eton. I got to be immersed. I was not myself from the upper classes, but I got immersed in the upper company of the upper classes. And British social class, I left Eton knowing, was a system that I wanted out of, and a system that I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to escape. So if you were planning to point out that later in my life I benefited and profited from having well-placed friends who I knew from Eton, that's true. That's true. But to find an alternative, well, what could be a better selected 180-degree alternative to go from Eton to go to Burma and to see imperialism face to face?
But you never quite got all of that privilege out of your system, even though you worked really hard at it. I remember reading that when you were in the Spanish Civil War, some of your compatriots admired you for being part of the Republican cause, but they sensed a kind of an upper crust English style and accent.
If you wanted to make it difficult for human beings to know each other, and we'll return to this, to know each other across place of origin, occupation of father, if you wanted to make a system that would keep people from very different origins from ever knowing each other, you could not do better than the British social class system. That engineered to perfection. I'm inclined to go ahead and say, I chose not to stay within those borders.
You could have gone perhaps to Oxford or Cambridge. I have to say, your grades were not very good. You didn't pay attention.
And how were yours?
Much better. I went to Oxford, thank you very much. But
they changed the admissions requirements, I would imagine. There had been some shift to that.
Yeah, they lowered them. They allowed
For Americans, they let in Americans.
Shall we get back to our conversation, sir? So you did not go to one of the great British universities. You entered the Indian service. So the class system in England, as you say, was rigid, oppressive. Just one more thing about your school days, because you wrote a famous essay about it called Such Were the Joys. I read it the other day to get ready for this, and I mean not to humiliate you in any way, but you wrote about it. You, at that time, were given to wetting the bed, and your masters called you in and humiliated you and beat you severely until the whips broke and the other instruments of torture broke. And I remember you're saying in that essay that you didn't cry from the pain, but some sort of indelible hatred of that kind of abuse of power was there from that moment.
Of course, of course. And you'll notice that thank you for mentioning that, I wrote the essay. I had the last word.
Right, and you stopped wetting the bed.
I hit them harder than they hit me.
Yes, you had
know
the
that
power,
essay.
You had the power of language.
I hit them harder than they hit me. They thought they were triumphant with a 13-year-old. They should have waited for a 38-year-old to come along on.
So let's move into your life as a writer. One of the things that you did to overcome the class system and privilege was to get down into the streets of Paris and London and Wigan Pier to see how the other half lived. Not only to observe it from the outside, which you rejected as bourgeois, but to immerse yourself in the actual pain and poverty and rats and lice and fleas and violence and theft and so on. Tell us why you did that and what effect it had. It certainly produced some of your best writing.
I think everyone knows that now. They know that I thought it doesn't have to be this way. The world I was born into and trained in and schooled by sadistic teachers, it doesn't have to be this way. Why would I say, well, I'll surrender? Why would I say that?
But you could have walked away. You didn't have to go down into the rugged streets of the East End.
You don't know me.
No.
I could have walked away.
Yes, you could have, but you didn't.
Why would you say that? That says you don't know me.
You couldn't have walked away?
I could not have walked away.
Because why?
Because I could not be imprisoned by that system that I abhorred. I could not submit to that. If beaten every day, maybe I would have. They quit beating me. They quit beating me. I am not going to say I came to a direct, clear sense of direction. I came back from Burma. I lived at home. I don't know that that's done anymore, but I went home. We thought he was out of the house. Now he's back. So I was back at home. My father was there much of that time. I taught school. I was poor. I wasn't getting, no one would have necessarily said this fellow is going somewhere. In fact, they probably would have said the opposite of that. Then when I got that vision, I'm not sure I'd call it a vision, that the need to be outside the boundaries, knowing people who society would never have encouraged me, would never have permitted me to go where I went and to be as immersed as I was. Once I had found that, I had not only found myself as a person who knew what to do with oppressive authority and how to say, get out of my way to that authority. I got that, but I also got now I am a writer. Because this can't stop with me. The experience I have had and going outside those boundaries, that cannot just be my experience. That has to go to others. And writing, that has to be, whether I know it will be successful or not, well, how could you possibly know that? It can't be. But you know you have to take an experience that others will not have, and you have to open that experience to them. Whether they will rise to that or not, you can't know.
And you sense that you couldn't write about it without being in it. You can't dabble in that and know it.
Oh, good heavens, people write about things they know nothing about. You don't know me, do you?
So you met strangers. You became an advocate for what we call the underclass. You wanted to see how the other half live. Jack London did much the same in much the same period of time with his book, The Abyss. You learned some lessons from that, but you also then became George Orwell. You were born
I did.
Eric Blair, but now you are becoming the famous writer, or the writer at least, George Orwell. Explain that.
Well, I want to take a little journey back further in time to the child Eric Blair. I was a child who made up stories. I like making up stories. I had a habit that I understand a lot of people have. I might just ask this group if any of them have that habit, where you do think you might, well, who knows whether you think you want to be a writer, but you have a habit of having an experience as a child and you are writing it in your head. The boy walked into his bedroom and opened the window. I did that sort of thing. I was not living a very interesting life, but I would be writing it in my head. The boy closed the window and left the room. This is not literature, this was not great, but this was me showing where I was probably going to go. Is there anybody else in the room who ever did that as a child?
Of course, yes.
Well, they're not used to talking to dead people. I guess that's the problem here. They're not really ready to engage in familiar conversation with me. Anyway, I was doing that. I had that habit, and I knew that was going to be back when I needed it. So yes, so I chose to write under the name George Orwell, named after a stream, and I did that partly to avoid embarrassment from my family, but also because Eric Blair never went away. Friends called me that. My son's last name was Blair. So it was never, Eric Blair's gone, someone else has come. But a person who had a stance in the public and an existence in the public and a voice and who could be heard, that was George Orwell.
A pen name, and a very successful one indeed.
Pen name, but deeper more than that. Because I had equal what happened to George Orwell and what happened to Eric Blair, the responsibility was on me equally, and they were both great responsibilities.
Of course. I believe you have mentioned 4 principles of writing that are important to you. Explain,
Yes.
please.
Okay. I would like to say, and because I haven't confessed that in the mid-1940s, that I think that from the very start, my literary abilities and my ambitions were mixed up with a feeling of being isolated and undervalued. I don't want anyone thinking this was massive confidence, quite the opposite. So over time, I had to think about what are my motives for taking this way of addressing my sense of isolation and not being valued. The 4 things I identified. 1, and this won't surprise anyone about authors, sheer egotism. Me, getting me out there. 2nd, aesthetic enthusiasm. And for me, that meant a paired and constantly intertwined sense of beauty, the beauty of the world. Thank you for letting me see this. The beauty of the world and the beauty of words in the right arrangement. Those 2 forms of beauty, to me, they came together.
Egotism, aesthetic enthusiasm, 3 and 4.
A 3rd would be historical impulse. And I want to give you my words for using that, because I don't know that historians in my time or any time really thought in these terms, but I think it's the core of the historian. The desire to see things as they are, to find true facts, and to store them up for the use of posterity. That would be the 3rd one. The 4th one, and this too takes just a moment to explain, political purpose, with political in the widest sense, the sense I mean of political desire to push the world in a certain direction, to alter other people's ideas of the kind of society they should strive for. So those 4 motives, you'll soon be asking me why I wrote 1984, and there's your answer.
All right. So you have a long, complicated relationship with socialism. After the war, Britain discarded the man who saved England, Churchill, and put in a socialist government. In 1984, you talk about INGSOC, English socialism. you wrote an essay, which I think is quite amusing, in 1946 called Can Socialists Be Happy? Talk about your complicated relationship with socialism.
I think I can be brief about this. I am a socialist. I was a socialist. I was never anything but a socialist. And socialists irritated me beyond tolerance.
Why?
They are people who, the word's priggish, they're self-important, disconnected from the world, concerned about their own social status. They are socialism's greatest burden, socialists. And
wait a minute. Socialism's greatest burdens are the socialists themselves.
Of course. So this is what I wrote in chapter 11 of The Road to Wigan Pier, and for some reason you don't include that as an essay because I guess it was in a book, so it doesn't count as an essay. I don't know. You're a literary scholar.
Therefore not an essay, but go ahead, you know.
Oh, literary scholars. I loved them in my time, and I'm trying to love them now.
Genre studies, but go ahead.
All righty. So in an essay that appears in The Road to Wigan Pier, which is a book, it's called Chapter 11, which I think has got some amusing resonance for your country. But in any case, Chapter 11 is a full-out attack on socialism.
It's quite a satire on socialism.
I'd go with attack. You literary scholars, you'll do what you want. So, in order to defend, this is what I say right at the start. In order to defend socialism, it is necessary to start by attacking it. So I did. Some parts a little bit cruel when I make fun of those two funny old guys on a bus, who I say are the worst looking people. Oh, I shouldn't have done that. Well, maybe I should have. But I do a little bit more intense individual mockery that probably wasn't necessary to do that. But I had such a wonderful time with that. Now, where I really got, oh Lord, did I get wind in my sails on this, much more serious. This was earlier, but when some left-wing British people could not see Stalin as who he was. People on the left wing couldn't see the horror of Stalin. And I wrote about, they're beyond mockery. So people on the left who aspire to a more equitable society, as I've said, this planet is like a life raft with lots of stuff on it. There's enough for everyone if you would distribute it around that. I am a socialist, and I despair over socialism, and I wanted and needed to, and I'm glad that I outraged many socialists by what I said about them. And I'm just going to say I know nothing about your times, but if it comes up, ask yourself, is there something of value to be done? Is it maybe the most valuable thing you can do if you follow in my footsteps and you make fun of the people who share your political beliefs? Might be good for them, might be good for you. So yes, I am a socialist. I'm proud to be a socialist, and they make my skin crawl sometimes.
So just a couple of quick things about that. First of all, you often use the word democratic socialist to distinguish yourself from the camp, the tribe of socialists. But I want to re-emphasize what you just said, that one of the gravest mistakes that the socialists made in Britain and in the United States was an early love affair with Soviet communism, and the sense that it was possibly utopian and the wave of the future. And people went there and they became enamored of it and they became advocates. And when the show trials and the pogroms and the deliberate starvations and so on came to the attention of the West, many of those people that you are criticizing refused to accept it, and they put blinders on. And nothing outraged you more than people who thought they were utopians apologizing for Stalinism and all that comes with it.
Yes, that's what I said.
Yeah, just trying to reiterate. All right. So, let's talk about religion. I'm really intrigued by this because, of course, you grew up in England, and there's a state church in England, the Anglican Church, and you move in and out of the Anglican world, baptisms, confirmations, you attended church services, you loved the liturgy. In some ways, you were a quintessential Englishman in that your love of these kind of ancient rituals and the somewhat dilapidated churches and the vicars and so on, and yet your religious sensibilities don't quite match your love of that ritual. And then in the end, you were buried under the Anglican service, and your advocates I'm sorry to bring this up, but your advocates had to work hard to find a cemetery in the Anglican tradition that would take you.
Right.
And eventually you were buried in Oxfordshire.
Well, I wouldn't know about the last part.
Right, of course, but
so.
Well, I'm informing you, but talk about your relationship with the Anglican Church.
Certainly a bearer of good news with that. Thank you for sharing that. I suppose that I'm a vexation. I already understood that from you, that I am a vexation to the people of the future who would like to put me into categories or put essays into.
They just want to understand. They just want to understand.
Right, but the people of the future will be as puzzled by me as the people of my time were. I don't fit in categories. Welcome aboard here. They knew it back then. Now you can see that now. I don't fit in categories. I'm very grateful for my time, the time I spent with clergy in the Church of England. I found them to be some of the most thoughtful and well-read, maybe not quite so well-read as this group, but well-read. Enjoyed their company. I liked ceremonies. I did undergo confirmation. I felt, I had a perfect horror of Catholicism. Let's not talk about that.
May I just mention?
No, I don't want to talk about Catholicism. I don't. No.
But may I mention there's some anti-Semitism in your writing too?
Not in a very major way.
Go on.
Catholics are much worse.
That's understood.
Really?
I'm just listening. But so.
Okay. Alrighty. So what I would like to mention is that what I would like to say is just what I said. This is a quotation of what I wrote in a public place. You cannot have any worthwhile picture of the future unless you realize how much we have lost by the decay of Christianity.
Explain.
I thought I might.
Yes.
And I would be doing that right now.
We're much intrigued.
Okay, let's go here. So Christianity gave people a sense of right and wrong. Christianity hinged that on a belief of heaven and hell. Who knows? Who knows? Not to speak to you out of place here. I know more than you know.
About what comes later.
I'm dead.
Yeah, we understand.
I don't seem dead, do I understand your point? But look what the shape this is not me. Good God, I'm here as a woman. God, oh, Lordy.
Would you quote that sentence again?
I was trying to.
That's really an important sentence.
You cannot have any worthwhile picture of the future unless one realizes how much we have lost by the decay of Christianity. With Christianity, there was a moral anchorage. There was a sense of doing this bad thing will carry this really serious eternal penalty. And when you take that away, you have unmoored populations. You have unmoored nations. You have people who are trained, conditioned to think, well, there's some major force. There's a God somewhere. Well, what if that God then loses standing that the Christian churches gave it, that God, and then one-time believers go looking for something else and they find Stalin, or they find Hitler, or they find Big Brother. So I was deeply worried about what would happen without that mooring. And then I will say something that I wouldn't ask you to trust me. I have no idea if it's true, but please remember, I spent my life fearful of what was going to happen to my health. And people seek something when they have that lifelong struggle. And remember, I never conceded. I never said, well, I'm frail and that'll do it for me. But it wouldn't, it's some part of my soul. I would not be surprised if I enjoyed the company of the clergy for reasons beyond the fact that they read a lot and were enjoyable to converse with. I think I found the notion of being in the company of people of faith, whether I could share entirely in that faith, I wanted that, and that's why I put in my will that I wanted to be buried in a Church of England graveyard, and I wanted the name Eric Blair. on the gravestone.
So let me ask this question. For Christianity to have that valuable social restraining capacity that you're talking about, and the loss of which is chaos, do we need to believe, or does the church have an independent standing without belief?
I have no idea.
Okay, good. Let's talk about war.
Let's.
Here's another paradox. You love war.
I do. I went to the Spanish Civil War as a volunteer, and I went on principle because the fascists, Franco and the fascists, were in power, and I needed to take a stand there. So I went to the war, and I wanted to be there because that was a place where people of principle were to be, and I really wanted a machine gun. And I did everything I could to get a machine gun. To learn Spanish, that was very hard. That was not easy to do at a certain stage, but I learned ametralladora. Dame una ametralladora. Give me a machine gun. That was the Spanish that I really wanted to learn very fast. So I wanted a machine gun, and I don't know what other testimony I could give that I find something magnetizing about war. And when I was in my 40s, when World War II started, I wanted to fight, and I was not of the right age. I did not have what they considered the right training, so I had to be in the Home Guard, which is not what I wanted. I was at BBC, did some war correspondent. I did things in war, but I said I would give my life for England readily if I thought it necessary. And when it came to fighting, fascism in Spain, once World War II was over and we could see, not everyone could see, but everyone could see what a horror Stalinist Russia was, I would give my life for England readily if I thought it necessary, and I would indeed have had reasons to think it necessary. So my summing up statement for war, and maybe I'll say this quickly and we can move on to a book that I think we might chat about in a bit, I don't know. Although everyone's read it, so it's not preaching to the choir, that's not the right phrase, speaking of church. Anyway, my phrase here, war may be necessary, but it is certainly not right or sane.
Interesting. So you went to the Spanish Civil War, you were shot in the throat, you couldn't speak for a number of months, it nearly killed you. Your wife Eileen was also there, and one of the things you discovered was factionalism within the Republican cause, and for a period of time you and your wife were on the run because some of the Republicans regarded you as Trotskyites and betrayers of the revolution.
Yes, and this is such a tangled tale, and in some ways I wish I'd never seen it. But in terms of getting disillusioned with people who adopt left-wing causes, they are so able to turn on each other and so able to forget what their shared ideals were, and that is especially true when Russian communism is in any form represented by people in those conflicts. So, disillusioning you could say, but also really important to know.
Of course, Trotsky was murdered, and anyone who could be associated rightly or wrongly with Trotsky was persona non grata at that time. War comes up again in the conversation we're about to have. It's time to get there. So you wrote this book.
I did.
Published in 1949, your last book, the one most people know. And I want to ask you about that, but I want to just do a little costume change myself, if I might, to get ready for this, because I've been so looking forward to talking about this book. And if I can disrobe a little, you don't need to, but just to show you that I have my Orwell t-shirt.
Wow.
Did you know you would be merchandised? You couldn't have thought that.
I'm taking, this is not clearly communicated exactly, but I'm understanding that did you make that for yourself individually? That's the question.
No, capitalism gave me that.
But I think he is trying to convey to me that this book, is this an old t-shirt?
I beg your pardon?
It's
a brand new t-shirt, never worn before. I ordered it.
So you're so far ahead of me, I feel very left out here. But my understanding from that shirt is that my name
yes,
and that book
Yes.
are still recognizable?
Universally, one of the most recognizable books written in English, and certainly one of the most recognizable books of the 20th century. And it has become extremely important again in the last dozen years or so, because the world is having a strange flirtation with authoritarianism. And one of the ways that people have coped with this abroad and at home, but mostly abroad, is to go back to your book, and they find solace in it, they find warning in it, they find hope in it, and they find discouragement in it. But it is a key text as people try to sort our way through this extraordinarily difficult time in modern history. You wrote this book. What an amazing achievement.
Thank you. Thank you. I didn't think I was dying when I wrote it. But nearly everyone I knew thought I was dying, including my bride. She knew. Not everyone knew the date or anything like that, but they knew. No one ever said, "This will be your last book." No one ever said that, but months in a hospital. I was watching responses for 6 months. I could watch them for 6 months. I could see what was happening. I could see that it was getting a lot of attention. I could see that. I could see things that were going wrong, that people were thinking, that this was my statement, that we should give up on socialism. I saw reviews. I saw people saying, this is George Orwell's confession, that there is no reason to do anything but surrender on socialism. I never said that. I said be better socialists, be socialists of quality and principle. So I saw that that was happening. I saw that the message that I had never intended was being found in that book. I did not like that. And sick in a hospital, I was writing to people saying, correct that. That's not what I wrote about. Don't say that. So I had no reason to think I could hope. Well, I mean, it's so complicated because I called it, I said to people it was a satire or a parody. And then that people would say, but isn't it seems like it's a warning. I thought, well, think about that, guys. Think about that, critics, because is there a better way to issue a warning than as a satire and a parody? If you want to issue a warning and you want to lose your audience, write something that is unreadable and ponderous and carries no feeling and so on. But if you want people to pay attention to it, write it in an unexpected way that sneaks past their defenses and gets them turning pages. Are Julia and Winston going to have sex? Well, possibly they will. Build that in. I mean, do that. Put that in there. Keep them turning pages. Because otherwise, why would you bother with a warning if only the people who already believed it were going to read it? So I'm having such mixed feelings. I'm not doing well at speaking here because I am, as an author, we talked about ego as a motivation for a writer. As a writer, that couldn't be better news. Can you imagine to have such news that this book sells to this day?
I can tell you this, that it has been translated into 67 languages and 30 million copies have been sold worldwide. Few books have that capacity or that history. My question for you is this, and I mean no disrespect, so please don't take it in that way. You were well regarded, but you were not a best-selling author. You were well regarded, and this book sort of, I think, would have surprised you that it became a phenomenal international bestseller that continues to sell millions of copies 75 years later. When you wrote it, did you have any idea that it had capacities beyond the other books that you wrote, which were very well received, but they were not selling in the tens of thousands?
I will say that the Second World War and the dropping of the atomic bombs at the end of that war had told me that the context of the globe and the people on this planet had changed. I knew that. And I think, but this is getting so hard for me to think about, much less speak about. So the ego of the author, enormously gratified. The sorrow of a person who loved being alive and who hoped for, who had a child I adopted. Richard, I adopted in I do know his name.
I was just trying to help them.
Well, in 1944, I adopted a baby. My wife was frail, but joined me that she died only a few months after I adopted Richard. And I did everything I could with my own illness. My sister helped. I hired a nanny caretaker. I did everything I could to make sure that Richard would be okay. But I guess I am saying that with a child who I knew, even if I lived longer, would outlive me, I hoped that what I wrote about in this would become, well, mocked, humorous. He thought these terrible things were going to happen. Nothing like that happened. Nothing happened like that. Boy, did he get that wrong. As an author, I am delighted, not delighted, my ego is gratified by knowing that this went on and on. As a human being who brought a child into, didn't bring the child into the world, but welcomed the child into the world, I'm not anything but shaken to believe that this book is still so relevant, and that the warning, well, I don't even know. I don't know. Maybe the warning, are they reading it because it's so completely irrelevant to anything that they might worry about today? I don't.
Well, let me start in a different way, but I want to get to that. And we're getting close to the end of our discussion. The audience will have a chance to ask some questions. But you predicted not only in 1984, or at least warned, but also in your essay, You and the Atomic Bomb, which you wrote in 1945 after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that it was quite likely that there would be nuclear war in Europe in the 1950s. That did not happen.
Thank you.
That did not happen. You also worried that England would descend into a kind of a socialism that made life dreary, and that the industrial plant would decay, that housing would be substandard, that people would be living in kind of shabby sufficiency, that there would be an oppressive government that surveilled people with a telescreen in their houses, that people would disappear and never be seen again, that they would be literally written out of history, that history would be rewritten and reshaped, including photographs by some sort of method in a dark room, that there would be torture, and that there would be continuous war, and all of that would be supported by state propaganda, and people who had any attempt to be individuals, like Winston Smith, the hero of the novel, or Julia, his girlfriend, would be found out, tortured, and eventually killed. Did any part of you think that would happen to England?
I never thought I could see the future, saying, well, what I wrote after the book came out, I could still be heard. I wrote an address to the world. This doesn't have to happen. It's up to you. So that's all I could do.
And it hasn't happened. Now, there may be some little pieces of it, surveillance. There are 28,000 surveillance cameras in New York City alone. People bring Alexa and other devices into their houses, which are telescreens, which can be surveilled under certain conditions. There is torture, and not just in the rest of the world, but sometimes including by the United States. So, in other words, some of the things that make people come back to the book are things that they sense are maybe happening, or could happen, or are already happening. But nobody believes that the United States is the world of 1984, but North Korea, for example, quite definitely is, and Russia in certain ways quite definitely is, and Venezuela. So there are places that have sort of borne out your worst warnings about how technology and power and class and war will oppress humanity and eliminate individual personality, but that has not happened in the first world, and you must be very pleased about that.
When you told me that there had not been a nuclear war, that was worth the trip, big time, to hear that. I listened a little bit, and there was put these things away. There was some stuff about that at the beginning, and as I understand it, the telescreens are very small now, and people carry them around voluntarily.
Oh, much worse, people routinely give away their privacy. They post the most personal and intimate things, thinking that they'll only stay within a small circle. We have a form of correspondence now that can easily be captured and leaked. People sign up for certain types of, I won't try to explain it, but programs, and they often sign off giving corporations the capacity to follow their movements and their purchases and where they stay in hotels and what sort of beer or wine they drink. This isn't the state coming in as big brother to do this. This is people just giving this away voluntarily.
I'm glad I'm on a short visit. I want to check. I overheard a conversation when I came in with two people who were reminiscing about the start of a war sometime in the last 20 years.
We've had a lot of that.
So I happened to overhear that conversation about a war, and I wondered if it's the war that I thought I could see coming of three major spheres of influence: East Asia, Eurasia, Oceania. So was it that kind of war that I overheard about the starting of? Was about 20 years ago?
No, that's not the kind of war we have. We've had, for a long time after World War II, there was something called the Cold War, which was a little bit sort of what you predicted. That
they say that I made up the phrase.
You made up the phrase, yes, in an essay. Two great powers with satellite powers, always sort of looking at each other with hostility, fighting little skirmish wars on the end, but never in a full-on confrontation. So that's exactly what you described in 1984, but you have three areas rather than the two that emerged. But since then, it's been colonial wars, resource wars, wars about security, and so on. But there has not been that kind of continuous war of the major powers against each other. And you say in 1984, they don't really want to win. They just want to maintain the status quo, but also to use it as a way to keep down the proles, to keep down the mass of humans in permanent poverty. That was your view.
Right, but I'm also thinking that in 1984, I saw war as the way that the people could be distracted from the things that they should not have been tolerating, because with war, now we're at war against these people, now we're at war against that. So the wars of the last 20 years here or so, have the people been paying close attention to that? Have they been?
No, the most of the people are essentially indifferent to all of that because it doesn't touch them very closely. But I want to move on just quickly because we have to get to some Q&A, and I want to really blow your mind if you think some of these other things. And I won't explain it, but in 1984, when somebody is no longer acceptable within the established circles of that government, he is made to disappear, and then his photographs are doctored in a darkroom so that he disappears, and books are rewritten and reprinted using fairly crude technologies of printing and darkrooms to change history so that in a certain point, no one will know what actually happened. We now have something called artificial intelligence, and it is going to enable us to change everything instantaneously and usually without a trace. And so the things you feared, that rewriting history in that very clunky, low-tech way of 1984 is infinitely more sophisticated now. And a question that people has is, what will truth be when it can be so easily be manipulated, not just by great nation states, but by individuals and factions and groups?
So is there a ministry of truth?
No.
Is there a centralized place and staff that takes things and falsifies and distorts them? Because that's where Winston worked.
Not government, but party. And let me give you an example which is really extraordinary, because you talk about doublespeak, that two ideas can be simultaneously embraced, even though they really can't cohere in the same sentence. I mean nothing political about this, but a recent president was inaugurated, and at his inauguration there were about 600,000 people. A day or two later, his secretary told the public, told the media as we call it, that it was the largest gathering at any inauguration in history. It was demonstrably untrue, but when that president's aide was asked how this could be, she said, well, there are alternative facts. And you know what happened? The next day, your book spiked, and Penguin published 75,000 copies in the next week to meet the demand, because when people heard that there are alternative facts, they went straight to doublespeak. They went straight to 1984, and they wanted to go there and filter this bewilderment through this book. Think of the power that you have had, that when something happens of a really relatively minor thing, this isn't about war and peace or about nuclear exchange, this is about crowd size, but when this happened, it led to a gigantic republication and sale of your book, because that's where people think this book is still fundamentally relevant. And it's nonpartisan. It's not just one party, but this is where the world is now.
So I'm wondering how my name, is it the book that people are thinking about? Do they know the name Eric Blair? Do they?
No.
Some. What do they use references to my name? Could you?
Yeah, so we're going to close with this, and here's the term that comes up by people who have never read your book, by people who wouldn't even know that you were a writer, but the term that we use is Orwellian. And when we say Orwellian, we mean surveillance, torture, discrimination, disappearances, propaganda lies, permanent war, the class system keeping down as the poor, Big Brother and Orwellian are essentially synonymous. And so Orwellian is a dystopian word for us, meaning a nightmare world, and that is almost the exclusive meaning of it in our time. How do you feel about that?
The things I tried to prevent, things I tried to warn people about, they associate with me. They say Orwellian, and they mean the things that I tried to say. Don't do that. Think about that. So it's not, I don't think it's too late. I am not a fatalist. I am not a fatalist. Change that word.
Well, what would you prefer? Stalinesque?
Fuck that.
What?
Stalinesque?
Right, I mean, what's better than Orwellian for
I
this?
thought you were going to call me I didn't know.
No,
I had no idea what you were saying.
The term for this dystopian nightmare.
I leave that to you.
All right. But you would rather we not use Orwellian in that sense?
If I could say what you asked me to say.
Yes.
Okay. Why not say something accurate when you say Orwellian?
Right.
Why not say, and there's so many excellent choices here, I'll just go for maybe two. Orwellian would be a determination to refuse to stay within boundaries of who we should speak to and who we should know, and to cross those boundaries and to meet other human beings under terms where I cannot say I felt comfortable on those first visits, but where you go and spend time with people who would have been strangers if you hadn't made that move. So Orwellian, a person, a group, a nation that goes to meet people and become acquainted. That would be one.
Nice try. That ain't going to happen.
I'm going to tell you.
That ain't going to happen. Give us another one.
I want, if you would let me.
I will,
Okay.
but that's not going to. That's not going to be the meaning of Orwellian.
Oh, I so enjoy your spirit. It's so.
I'm just trying to tell the truth here, but give us another one.
You're not going to respond to this next one.
Okay.
Thank you. And everyone else is free to, but why not Orwellian? And we haven't spent much time on this, but The Politics of the English Language is a remarkable essay I wrote. The most important part of that book, by many measures, is the one that probably nobody reads, the appendix on Newspeak and the transformation of the language. So I have been so explicit in saying that poor, careless, uncrafted use of language is tyranny's best friend. If you want to give grounding to totalitarianism, then do it by degrading the language, by denying yourself the words. How can you speak against totalitarianism if you do not have those words and if you do not know how to make those words work for you? That's Orwellian. That's what I did. I knew that words, as you brought up, they beat me as a child. I wrote about them. They didn't look good in that. So Orwellian, to know the power of words against oppression, tyranny, totalitarianism. That's Orwellian.
Last question.
If you're not going to
Last question.
That. Thank you.
There are hundreds and hundreds of articles about you, many dissertations and master's theses, a number of great biographies. Your diaries have been published, your letters have been published. There's a whole Orwellian industry and scholarship, but I think you said no biographies.
Good luck with your own declarations and instructions to the future. I said no biographies of George Orwell or Eric Blair. No biographies.
Well,
didn't happen?
We did it. Let's take some questions. Questions for George Orwell.
Shall we thank George Orwell?
Let's do questions for George Orwell, and then we'll break character here in a minute.
I would like to vary that just by one moment, because I know some people are going to be departing. In fact, they're departing now, and there's something I wanted to say as Patty Limerick.
Sure.
Okay.
George Orwell disappears, we now have Patricia Limerick.
Yeah, so alrighty. So I just had a couple of things I wanted to say really quickly. That I did have some, Patty Limerick had some troubles with the University of Colorado. That would be me. It didn't go so well, but it all turned out fine. And I have a new thing called the Applied History Initiative. And in 2 limericks, I can sum up my status. And then I have something much more important to say. About 2 years ago today, a dean felt empowered to say, "You're out of a job, but rather than sob, I decided I'd rather just stay." Okay, there's that one. And for months, I was trapped and mired in a center that's now expired. Rather than sighing, lamenting, or crying, I'm better off fired than hired. So I used to be at the Southern American West. I'm now at Applied History Initiative, and it's a much better world, and I have a lot more money than I had before I was fired. So
Patty Limerick does limericks. Patty Limerick does limericks.
Well, thank you. Thank you. But that's not, the closing remark was the one I wanted to make. That I wanted to say what I believe the bedrock mission of historians. I am an historian. I hang out with historians a lot. I train young historians. The bedrock mission of historians, which we never talk about with the public, and we rarely talk about among ourselves, the role of the historian, the mission of the historian, is to lend our voices while we are still on the planet to those who came before us and who have been silenced by death. No one has performed this mission so consistently and effectively as Clay Jenkinson.
What?
Don't listen to that. I didn't say it. Forget it.
No,
it wasn't worth listening.
That was
to.
double speak, and you should never do that. All right. So let's take just a couple of quick questions.
Okay.
We're out of time.
I'm
There's one back here.
I'm returning to Orwell.
Are you back to Orwell? All
Yeah.
right. Or Patty. That was lovely.
You described how your experience in India and your experience in the Spanish Civil War, colored your view of the world. Did you ever spend any time in Germany or in the Soviet Union in Russia? And if not, how did you gain your experience? We all know what happened during those times and about Stalin, but what was your source of information during your formative years?
That's an extremely good question, and really raises if I felt you should go see things, why wouldn't I go there?
Why not?
I just, of all the places where I would have wanted, could I pretend it was my health? I don't recall that it was not an idea I spent much time on, of thinking, I was an enormously energetic letter writer. And maybe somewhere in my letters I said, well, I really should make this journey. For someone who didn't accept authority easily, apparently to the best of my memory here, I seem to have said, I know what's going on there. But that's not my way in the world. So you have...
it's a really good question.
It's a really great question.
And you never came here. And you had an ambivalent attitude to the United States, admiration, but also criticism. You never did come here. And at the end of your life, you needed an experimental drug only available in the U.S., and your friends tried, just heroically to get that to you and didn't get it to you in time.
Yeah.
It would have prolonged your life almost certainly. Another question, if there is one.
This is your shot. You're asking questions of a legend.
Here's one. And then we'll do one more.
We have 10 minutes, don't we?
George,
10 minutes?
I know, but they're...
I would like to tell you and ask you how you would feel about the fact that almost everyone in here over a certain age read your book short while after it was published in the United States as grade school and junior high students. And we loved it.
That is such an interest and wonderful to know that that was happening and may still be happening. But I'm going to ask you, is that a papillon? Is your dog a papillon? A papillon, I thought it was a papillon. I knew some French people. I was in France for a time, so papillons. So how does that affect a child to read that book? And I gather we have quite a few people who could help me with that. I didn't think, oh, I will tell you, this is a painful thing to say to you, but when I was writing that book, Richard was a small child, and his main thought about the person writing that book was that his father couldn't get out of bed to play with him. So now you're telling me that no one as young as he was, but that children read my book. Does it dishearten them? Does it make them feel better prepared for life?
They're pretty young at that stage. I think that they read it as science fiction. They read it as a science fiction classic. You know, and there's a little sex in it, so that's a slight warning sign. And we won't go into all of that, but you know, if you could have written a tract, but you wrote a novel instead, and it's a very fine novel. And as you said, there's an aesthetic purpose in your work as well as a search for political truth, and then ego too. But you didn't want to write a tract, you wanted to write a novel. And so that gives you some detachment from the warnings, right? And makes it worth reading for people that might not be interested so much in the predictions and the warnings.
Well, I'm just very curious about how I certainly would be, I'm falling apart now as a clarity of character here, but I do not think it was a YA novel.
Right. Is there a last question over here?
But I really appreciate the fact that I guess what I really appreciate is that it's a gesture of respect to young people to say, you can take this in.
What happened to Richard?
Tell us about Richard.
Richard.
I guess you'd better be Patricia Limerick for this one.
Oh, yes. Yes. I wouldn't know. He was, okay, this is what I know as Patty. He is still with us. He had happy memories of his childhood when we didn't get to go there too much, but Eric Blair was a real nature lover. So he chose to be on Jura in the Scottish Hebrides, and it was a beautiful natural environment, and every time an eagle came anywhere near, Orwell wrote in his diary about that, and Richard was out frolicking all the time. So Richard's memory was not, oh, my father was dying. Richard's memory was we were in a beautiful place, and he was well taken care of, and he succeeded in life. He made money, and at a certain age, I think fairly recently, he became the driving force of, I guess it's called the Orwell Foundation, and he puts heart and soul and enlists other people in remembering his father. Thank you for asking on.
Sir, Dale, and here's one up here.
Question, if George Orwell were alive today and were writing the book 2084, what would he change or write about?
Isn't that something? Well, alrighty, let's just give, who am I now? Who am I? Who am I? Am I?
You're the futurist, Patricia Limerick.
Okay, alrighty. Okay, I think that there probably should be a group of young folks brought together to do this in a collaborative, brainstorming way. And they should read the Orwell book And then they should say, and they should have a good leader of the older person leading them probably part of the time and then stepping aside. They should say, what really works in this? What really gets into a reader's mind and stays there and carries a message? And they should appraise what went well there. And then they should take up a question that I was going to raise as Orwell, and will raise now. Did Orwell do something that was not strategic and might have been inadvertent by so totally squishing the rebels, by having Julia and Winston so totally defeated? Was that a good idea? That last part is so. I was when I was rereading it last time, I was in a hotel that had a breakfast room. This is a little bit funny. We're getting so much on the children's issue here. I was down to the last 25 pages, 30 pages, and I would not read that alone in my hotel room. I went down to the breakfast room because I knew that that room has populated, been that way the morning before, with children going, "He took my banana," and it was very life affirming, and they were all there, and they're all very peppy. So I read those last pages there because I wanted to have all that going on. So I guess I would say, project as he does from what was actually happening, track that trajectory, but at least consider not a happy ending, not that, because who's going to believe that, but have all these young people brainstorm if they're, well, first of all, Winston and Julia are going to be much more complicated, and race and gender identity, that's probably going to happen, and that will be good to have a lot of editing work on pronouns in this edition, that's good. But to really say, maybe even have the thing that is done in technology all the time, of multiple endings, choices of, do you squish Julia and Winston? Or do you have them say, run into each other and say, "Oh, rats." Cut their little heads off, for heaven's sake. Next time, never be so overpowered. Next time when you threaten you with rats, just bring rat poison. So just do something that is more affirmative of human possibility, because I think that's to me, when I am Orwell, I'm concerned about his attitudes towards women, which are pretty weird, not so good, and his attitudes, well, he did a thing where he created a list of left-wing people who he thought shouldn't be trusted, and he circulated that after the war, and that was a peculiar thing to do. But some of the people on that list shouldn't have been trusted, and people who admire him get really snarled up on that. But I think my greater, I'm not quite sure I want to be him, is that he gave no hope in that ending. And anything that was not really well crafted would have been just fluff and cotton candy and silly, but a really well-crafted, take it on. And the options are, I mean, I do get to spend a lot of time with young people, and they sometimes, especially I'm going to say I'm in a building with engineering students, they're just full of, we can take this on, we can do this. We have these problems. We know we can treat different forms of water pollution. We can do that. We can make all kinds of things. So I just think something, maybe I want it to be about engineers, because that doesn't seem right exactly, but the Limerick rule is you've never had a successful dinner party unless you've had an engineer there to explain how everything got there at the dinner party. So the celebration of engineers is a big thing there. Anyway, I love the question, and I just see so many excellent ways in which this could be, the classroom assignment. If it's being assigned in classes still, to have the students, write some appraisal of skip the part where you write your regular book report and do the part where you write the next part.
So I want to make a 1-minute run at that question. What would 2084 be? I think Orwell would say, "You damn fools, you are giving away your privacy and your freedoms. You are freely engaging in corporate surveillance. You have no idea what's at stake. You have no idea how these things can be misused. You've got to understand that freedom is incredibly fragile, and if you don't protect it with all of your might, this could happen." And I think that he would be appalled by the lack of privacy, as he would call it, and the lack of commitment to privacy and the integrity of the individual in our time. And I think he would be really wanting to shame us for this. last question.
Clay and Patty, thank you so much for such an entertaining historical rendezvous with George Orwell. George, I'm asking you this question. I thought I heard you say that you loved war. I would like to report to you that we've been in almost a continuous state of some kind of pretty serious conflict since you died. And the event of nuclear warfare is many multiples more dangerous than when you died. Is there a word you would like to invent for us in 2024?
Well, thank you for that. And I guess what I did say, I know, and I was magnetized by war, and I wanted a machine gun, and I would have continued to be a soldier if I could. And I didn't, my book, Homage to Catalonia, is a pretty grim book. So if I was trying to create the magnetic appeal of war, that book didn't do it. So, but necessary was the word I think that he was using, that I was lifting from him. I'm making a sudden shift and becoming Patty Limerick for a moment here, because I am campus partner for academic affairs for the Veteran Military Affairs Office, and I spend a lot of time with student veterans, and it drives me mad that so many civilians were oblivious to the global war on terrorism. That's me, Patty. And that's where I'm bringing George in. If I could have said to George, you thought people really paid attention to war, and now we had 20 years of ongoing war in different locations, and civilians were doing a lot of things and they weren't paying attention to that. I think he would join me and you in thinking, how could we have not have had that at the center of our attention? So I'm with you on that. I guess I would say, and you're totally right about that, it's Patty again, not George, that as if nuclear weapons weren't at issue anymore. And yet, we have, as Clay pointed out, we have not used them. We being all human beings on that. So there's that. I guess I would say some kind of, in terms of a word to use for this, dark hope. That I am so lucky. I'm working on some writing projects with my student veterans, and their voices, if we get those voices out, are so well, there are plenty of people writing about the global war on terrorism now, but I think these young enlisted people just have a force and a power, and every time that I am reading their work and talking to them, it is dark hope. They have seen, the ones who deployed have seen things that I don't think any young person should have seen, and they are taking it in and reflecting on it and putting it out to where people really will have to pay attention. So thank you so much for asking that question.
Patricia Limerick.
Oh.